Start by commending the majority leader who just came to the floor and offered a motion to go to conference on CARA. That's the Comprehensive Addiction and Recovery Act. This is an incredibly important piece of legislation because it will allow the United States Congress to be a better partner in fighting against this heroin and prescription drug epidemic that is seizing our communities. And this is a big step today because it says that we're going to send a few senators over to work with the House to come up with a consensus bill between CARA, which passed in this body on March 10th, by the way, by a 94-to-1 vote. That never happens around here, and it happened because after 2.5 weeks of debate on the floor, everybody realized this is an issue that had to be addressed, and that the legislation we came up with was the sensible and responsible way to do it. It was legislation we developed over a 3-year period. Senator Whitehouse and I were the leads on it. We had 5 conferences here in Washington bringing experts in from around the country. We took the best ideas, regardless of where they came from, and came up with a way to deal with the prevention and education aspect of this, to keep people from getting into the funnel of addiction in the first place. But then, for those who are addicted, to treat addiction like a disease that it is, and to get them into the treatment and recovery services that they need, and also to help our law enforcement, specifically to help our law enforcement with regard to Narcan, which is a naloxone, which helps to stop the overdose deaths. And also, we help to get the prescription drugs off of people's shelves and to avoid this issue of people getting into the issue of opioid addiction, sometimes inadvertently through prescription drug overprescribing. So this is a bill that actually addresses the problem in a responsible way. It's comprehensive. The House then passed its own legislation. They passed 18 separate bills, smaller bills, not as comprehensive, but which included some good ideas that were not in the Senate bill. One, for instance, raising the cap on doctors who are treating people with Suboxone. Some of those ideas should be incorporated as well. But the point is, we've got to move and move quickly. You think about this, since the Senate passed its legislation, which was on March 10th, we unfortunately have seen roughly 129 people a day lose their lives to overdoses. So many thousands of Americans have lost their lives even since March 10th. This legislation takes the right step to address that problem, and not to address just those who have overdosed and died, but those who are casualties of this epidemic, who have therefore lost their job, lost their family, lost their ability to be able to function. And as I talk to recovering addicts around my state of Ohio, I hear the same thing again and again: the drugs become everything. And this does cause families to be torn apart. It does cause crime. When I talk to prosecutors in my state, they tell me that most of the crime in one county, recently, a county prosecutor told me 80% of the crime is due to this heroin and prescription drug epidemic. So this is one that we must address for so many reasons. We must address it right away. So I'm pleased that we are finally appointing conferees. I hope that the other side wouldn't consider blocking this, because we need to move on with this to get this legislation to the President's desk. We have been talking with the House about their legislation, which was passed subsequent to our legislation, and talking about how to make some of these compromises to be able to come up with a consensus bill. I think we're very, very close. And again, I think there's some ideas in the House we should incorporate. I think there's some ideas in the Senate bill that must be included in the House bill that are not in any of the House bills now. One is with regard to recovery services. We know that the best evidence-based treatment and recovery can make a difference in turning people's lives around, and therefore we do support recovery services. And for those in the field, they will tell you it's not just about the medication-assisted treatment, it's that longer-term recovery that creates the success that we're all looking for. And then on the prevention side, we have more focus on prevention, specifically a national awareness campaign to get people, again, focused on this issue of the link between prescription drugs and the dangers there, the narcotic prescription drugs, and the opioid addiction issue. I can't tell you how sad it is to talk to parents back home who have lost a child because that child started on prescription drugs. In 2 cases, I can tell you about parents who have come to talk to me. One testified at a hearing that we had back in Cleveland, Ohio. 2 cases where the teenager went in to get a wisdom tooth extracted and was given painkillers, prescription drugs, and from that became addicted, and from that went to heroin, and from that, sadly, had an overdose and died. So this awareness, I think, is incredibly important, because most people don't realize that 4 out of 5 heroin addicts in Ohio started on prescription drugs. That awareness campaign alone will save so many lives. and create the opportunity for us to keep people out of that funnel of addiction in the first place. The grip of addiction is so strong that once you're in it, it's a huge challenge, but it's one that can be overcome, again, with the right kind of treatment and the right kind of recovery. So again, I'm pleased that Majority Leader came to the floor today to actually begin this process of the formal conference, to get this bill to the President's desk, and more importantly, to get this bill out to our community so it can begin to help and begin to turn the tide. It's not getting better. I wish I could say it was, but when I talk to people who are staffing the hotlines back home, they tell me, unfortunately, there's more calls coming in. When I talk to people in our hospitals back home, they tell me, unfortunately, there are more babies born with addiction who are showing up in the neonatal units. A 750% increase in my state of Ohio in babies born with addiction just in the last dozen years. Unfortunately, when I talk to people about the emergency room, I talked to an emergency room nurse last weekend. I was in Cleveland. I was at a festival talking to people, and an emergency room nurse came up to me, and I heard the same thing I've heard many times, which is you've got to do something about this issue. More and more people are coming to our emergency rooms seeking help. It's creating an issue in terms of jobs and employment, of course, because people who are addicted often are not able to work, cannot hold down the job, and cannot pass a drug test. So it's affecting our economy in so many ways, and of course affecting our families. And ultimately, it's about individuals not being able to pursue their God-given purpose in life because these drugs get them off track. CARA passed here in the Senate by a 94-to-1 vote, as I said. So there is common ground here among Republicans and Democrats alike. This is not a partisan issue. It never has been. From the start, over the last few years, we have worked together. In fact, we worked with the House, not just bipartisan, but bicameral, to put together legislation that both chambers could support. There are about 129 House members who are co-sponsors of the legislation that passed the Senate. We took ideas from the House and the Senate initially, and this is why I'm a little frustrated, frankly, we haven't made more progress already. Now's the time to move. Let's get this done before July 4th. Let's get it done next week. Let's get it to the President. Let's get it to our communities. There's no reason for us to wait. With this step today of the formal naming of the conferees, there is no reason for us not to move forward with this, and move forward with it in a way that shows we can work together as a House and Senate to solve these problems. Some have said, well, there might be some other ideas that will come up. That's fine. I hope there will be lots of new ideas that will come up, because there is no silver bullet. But we know this legislation will help. We know it's comprehensive. We know it's well thought out. We know it's based on best practices. Let's move forward with this now because it is urgent. One American every 12 minutes loses his or her life to overdoses. Since CARA passed, this means more than 11,000 Americans have died of overdoses. So since March 10th, when this legislation passed in the Senate floor, 11,000 Americans lost their lives. And again, doesn't include the hundreds of thousands more who are affected in such fundamental ways. People back home get this. When I was on a teletown hall meeting recently, one of my constituents called in, started talking about the legislation, the CARA legislation, the importance of more funding for evidence-based treatment that works. And there was something about the way he was describing it. I could tell this was personal. So I said, sir, can you tell us why you know so much about this and why you're so interested? And there was a pause. And I knew it was coming because I'd heard it too many times before. He explained that he had lost his daughter. She had been in and out of treatment programs, had relapsed. She had been in prison and out. She had finally decided that she was ready, that she wanted to accept a treatment program to be able to turn her life around. She was in a position to do so. They took her to a treatment center to get treatment, and there was a waiting list. And during the time that she was on that waiting list, I believe it was 14 days, was when they found her. She had overdosed. And his point was very simple. And you can imagine the emotion on the call. But his point was very simple. When someone is ready to seek treatment, we need to have treatment available for them. We're told that 8 out of 10 heroin addicts, 9 out of 10 people overall are not seeking treatment who need it. Some of that's because of the stigma associated with addiction. We need to wipe that stigma away to get people into treatment. Some of it is because there's not the availability of treatment. In some parts of Ohio and some of our rural areas, there literally is no effective treatment available. In other areas, in some of our urban areas, where there is good treatment available and some amazing places that are doing incredible work. They do have a waiting list at some of them. We also have a waiting list with regard to some of the longer-term recovery centers, residential centers in Ohio. That, again, is helped by this legislation. We also have a difficulty with some of our detox centers in some of our areas of Ohio where there's not enough room in the detox center, so the police don't know where to take people to get them started in this process. We hear stories constantly back home in Ohio about this issue because, sadly, we're one of the states that's hardest hit. We're top 5 in the country in overdoses, and fentanyl overdoses, we may be number 1. Fentanyl, by the way, is a synthetic form of heroin. And so people say, well, is it about prescription drugs or heroin? It's about the drugs. If it's not heroin, it may be fentanyl. If it's not fentanyl, next year it may be something else. It may go back to methamphetamines. It may be cocaine. It's about the drugs. And we can't take our eye off this issue because when we think we've solved one problem, another problem will crop up. Fentanyl, by the way, is produced synthetically. It is usually in the mail, mailed mostly from Ohio. Our experience, it's coming from China to the United States, made by chemists who don't care about our kids, our citizens, because they're making this deadly poison. Sometimes it's mixed with heroin, sometimes it's put into a pill form to try to indicate that it might be a prescription drug pill, which people might think is more safe, which is obviously not. This fentanyl is causing more deaths in my hometown of Cincinnati and in Cleveland, Ohio, than heroin these days. You hear stories like Nicholas DeKilo of Cleveland, Ohio. Nicholas was a bright young man, a gifted musician. He had a full scholarship to Northwestern University. His father died of a heroin overdose when he was a child. 2 decades later, sadly, Nick became a heroin addict himself after experimenting with it with a friend. It was an experiment, and he got addicted. And I hope people who are listening today understand this is something you cannot play with. You're playing with fire. He soon realized he'd made a tragic mistake. He said, and I quote, "Heroin took me to the depths of hell." That was his quote. Then his mother, Celeste, died of a heroin overdose in January. Nick was the one who found her body. That heartbreaking experience motivated Nick to get clean. He made a promise to himself he would not suffer that same fate, the fate of both of his parents. After his mother died, he was homeless. He tried quitting cold turkey. That didn't work. He wasn't able to do it. Most heroin prescription drugs addicts are not. He sought help. He sought treatment. He was clean for 2 months. "I'm just starting to like myself again," he said. "I have a whole lot more life to live. I have a whole lot more I want to do. I don't want to become another statistic." But then, sadly, he relapsed. He overdosed. He was found dead with a needle in his arm on May 4th in West Cleveland, Ohio. Memorial services are being held for him in Cleveland this week. That's what's happening in Northeast Ohio. In Southwest Ohio, a woman arrested by the Cincinnati police pled guilty last week to repeatedly trafficking her own 11-year-old daughter to her 42-year-old drug dealer in exchange for heroin. Sadly, she even gave this girl, 11-year-old daughter, heroin. So you get the picture. This is not in one zip code. This is not in one community. It knows no zip code. It's in our rural areas. It's in our suburban areas. It's in our inner cities. It's affecting every person, regardless of their station in life, regardless of their background. No one's immune from it. No one's unaffected by it. Ohioans know this is happening, and they're taking action, and that's positive. Terry Thompson of Bluffton, Ohio, has founded a group called Moms Against Heroin. Ohio Moms Against Heroin, and I commend her for it. She's got 7 kids, by the way, and 5 of them have been addicted to heroin at one point or another over the past 20 years. They're from a middle-class Ohio home. One son went to prison. Over the next year, 12 of his peers died of heroin overdoses. Terry's youngest daughter, a cheerleader, a soccer player, a talented piano player, made the mistake of trying heroin with her boyfriend. She became addicted. But one of her brothers, who got treatment and now is living a productive life, is a small business owner, encouraged her to get treatment too, as he had gotten. She did, and now she's living a sober life, a clean life, and a productive life. Some 700 Ohio moms have now joined Terry's group. We already know they've been saving people. They tell me a story about one woman who contacted the group when she needed treatment. Terry actually personally picked her up, drove her to detox. The woman has now been clean for nearly 3 months and is back on track. On June 18th, Terry and dozens of other Ohio moms will be rallying and marching in Findlay, Ohio, to educate people that addiction is a disease and it needs to be treated. Again, I commend her. I want to thank Terry and all those involved in this cause. She's a brave woman who is channeling her grief towards something constructive, and that is helping others to avoid this disease. In my hometown of Cincinnati, the Center for Addiction and Treatment, affectionately known as the Cat House, has announced a $5.7 million capital campaign to construct a new 17,000 square foot building to address the opioid epidemic. This will triple their capacity to be able to treat more patients. They'll be able to treat about 6,000 patients. They do great work. They've had great successes. Construction's already begun. It's expected to be completed within a year. I want to thank everyone who's made that possible, including the folks at the Cat House, but also the state of Ohio, the city of Cincinnati, Deaconess Health Association Foundation, and Bethesda, Inc. The University of Cincinnati former law school dean Joe Tomaine, who's a friend of mine, has been speaking out about this epidemic, writing in the Cincinnati Enquirer that, and I quote, "There is no more urgent need in our community than to address this drug scourge." I think he's right. I want to thank him for doing his part in helping lend his voice to those who don't have a voice. Madam President, I know the scope of this epidemic can sometimes feel overwhelming. And I know the way I've talked about it today, it's got to be frustrating for everybody hearing it. What are the solutions? How can we get at this? But we know that there is hope. We know that prevention can work. If it's the right kind of prevention, if it's really focused and targeted, we know that treatment and recovery can work. I've just given you some examples of that. Again, it's got to be evidence-based. It's got to be stuff that we are funding here because it works, not just because we want to throw more money at a problem. Reggie Gant of Columbus, Ohio, was a married father of 3. He had a good job at a paint company. He tore his rotator cuff. He was in pain. His doctor prescribed Percocet for the pain. He became addicted. When his doctor stopped filling his prescription, he started buying them off other people in the doctor's waiting room. When the pills weren't available or were too expensive, which is often the problem for these prescription drug addicts who turn to heroin, he switched to heroin. It was less expensive. It was more available. He was trapped in the funnel of addiction, and the drugs became everything. He lost his relationship with his wife and his kids. He started stealing from his workplace. "I did things I never thought I would do in a million years," he said. As I said earlier, the drugs are everything. But he got treatment, spending 40 days at an inpatient facility. He's been clean now for 6 months. He's getting help from the Lima Urban Minority Drug Abuse Outreach Program. He's beating this because he was able to step forward and get into treatment. It was there for him. People can beat this, and they do every day. Madam President, experts tell us 9 out of 10 of those who need treatment aren't getting it. As I said earlier, some of that is because of the stigma, some of that is because of lack of access to facilities in their communities. This House effort that was just undertaken with 18 separate bills, combined with the Senate bill, the Comprehensive and Addiction Recovery Act, CARA, will make a difference. It'll provide more help for the type of treatment programs and recovery efforts that actually work. If we can get this comprehensive bill to the President, we can help more people who are struggling get treatment. We can help give them more hope. It's time to act, and to act quickly to find common ground before we lose more of our fellow Americans. Let's get this comprehensive bill into law and begin to help those millions of our fellow citizens who are struggling with this epidemic. Thank you, Madam President. I yield.